This episode has been such a long time coming because I can't even count the amount of times we've referenced Chumashan, whether it's in examples of other traditions or when we've chatted about techniques. At some point, Salt has mentioned something that comes from this tradition. Like it's been around, haunting, if you will, the peripheries of Frightful Howls. But today is the day. We're finally, all thanks to our magnificent Salt, gonna actually get into what is this tradition and what are some of its spirits and its magics and everything like that. So like I'm pretty much beyond hyped. Like I'm roaring to go because this is something that we've been talking about for a while, about doing an episode for, and it comes at a great time too because we're just about to start having special guests. Yay. Quite a few people that we've been actually workshopping because we really don't want to be like an interview podcast in any way. We want to keep up the theme of the three of us or two of us or one of us or plus other people in some capacity, in some combination, talking about magic and practical application of sorcery and witchcraft, and also folklore that we find fascinating or traditions that we're studying or find interesting that we want to share a little bit about. And so we've definitely got a really cool roster of people that we actually are friends with in real life, if you will. And we would just want to talk about these very same topics with them as opposed to interviewing them, but more like just discussing things together, bringing them on as a plus one. And so right before we get into a few of those, time to address the specter, 5 immortals that have been stalking through the episodes, leaving their slithering trails and their paw prints and all sorts of good things. Salt, thank you for doing this.
It's been a long time coming, like I've been excited for this one. It's just been a matter of finally putting it all down on paper.
Yeah. Amazing. You know what? Let's get right into it because I'm pretty much I'm roaring at the bit to go.
大家好，Hello everyone，我们是 The Frightful House 美学 Podcast，我是教授，他们是叫 Swinger 和白线 Key，and we're your hosts today.
Whoa! Not only are
Mhm.
you introducing us a little bit differently than usual, but also Key is the B is Baishan. Did I get that right?
白线 the White
Baishan,
Immortal.
the White Immortal. And why is he the White Immortal?
Well, because it begins with a B, I think is the most important element. But the White Immortal is also one of the topics that we're going to talk about today. The usually associated with hedgehogs in particular, because as folks can probably tell from the episode title, we're going to be talking about animal saints or animal immortals in northern China.
Hell yeah. Fucking love to see it. I'm ready to go.
And I think we've been to China before, right, to talk about tigers, but
Mm-hmm.
that's mostly a south and a western thing. This time we're going up north to talk about popular religion, specifically the immortal faith or the immortal family, the cult of the 5 families who, they're the fox, the snake, the weasel, as well as the hedgehog and mouse saints. And you can also include the rest as ghost immortals as well. But we're not going to call them by the animal names throughout the episode. That's actually a bit of a taboo to call them by that. But for now, due to the English language and the fact that we need to introduce these spirits in a way that's comprehensible, they're not going to be too bothered. So,
Yeah, it's kind of like I think we mentioned this in the Master of the Wolves post for those talismans that Key and I made, but like in so many traditions, right, you don't say the name of the animal of the great spirit you're calling. So like a bear or a wolf, like you wouldn't say literally bear or wolf in that language, or even in English, you would say like he or the one from above or the hairy one. And that's like true for a lot of different traditions, right? But in this case, I think since they're saints or immortals, like they're high level up spirits, it's more important to call them by I think you might have mentioned to me, is it true that it's like colors, like the White Immortal, for example, or some titles?
colors are common, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Generally speaking, there's a number of different monikers. So for some of them, it's colors. For some of them, it's One of them is very lazy, as we're going to see. It's a human surname,
Yeah,
and for
yeah,
another, it's like Willow,
Mhm.
which is, I suppose, a reference to the appearance.
yeah.
So I think most of our readers or listeners, I suppose, have encountered these unusual beings in popular culture and various forms of media, right? Whether it's the legend of the White Snake, Daji and the Investiture of the Gods, or the Feng Shun Yanyi, or maybe anime, manga, Immortal Hero, Xianxia genre novels, which are one of my favorite vices. But
Yeah,
we're going to be
not
covering.
something that you spend many hours in bed after I'm trying to go to sleep
Mhm.
reading Shansha novels.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, they're so long that I picked them up and then dropped them halfway through and don't touch them for another 6 months because my
Mm.
eyes hurt. But sometimes when I have nothing else going on, which is getting rarer and rarer, that's the only thing left to do, you know?
I appreciate your summaries for the plots because sometimes I think that they're all one long novel. So I just like subsume plot points from like novel number 3 into novel number 25.
I mean, they are basically the same novel over and over again for the
Yeah,
most
yeah.
part. It's
Hmm.
not that there aren't good ones out there, but the majority of the ones that I read, no, they're not the good ones. They're just funny. But what we're talking about today, unlike the Xianxin novels, you're not going to find out there in English right now, not most of it. There's a few academic surveys, but beyond that, there's not too much out there, and they're focused on their own particular aims. So to start off with, I'm gonna ask you guys, since we're bringing up popular culture, have you seen any media depictions of these saintly or sometimes even demonic beings, and what was your favorite one?
Oh man. I guess with the 5 families, it's not particularly them. Like I've not seen media that is specifically about Chumashan as a tradition. Like I'm aware there's movies about Chumashan, and I'm aware that they have popped up in various different Chinese TV shows, but it's not something that I've personally encountered. The idea of the animal saints, though, I've definitely seen in anime and manga, the legends of Abe no Seimei and Tamamo no Mae, as well as Daji from China. So these nine-tailed fox motifs and the sorcerers who are descended from them or who subjugate them, like that's kind of what I'm more familiar with, especially with the fox family, since we're still going to use the animal names occasionally. Like that's something that I have encountered in primarily in Japanese pop culture, but also in K dramas and C dramas. And of course, Legend of the White Snake. Like there's no escaping that, I think. That's where I got my first taste of spirits that not just look like these animals, but were these animals themselves, and then they cultivated and became an ascended form. So that's the distinction, right? Is that they originally were literally physical animals that cultivated, and not just like they are other kinds of shape-shifting beings that happen to take this animal form and they dote on it or something like that.
Yeah, I mean, it's almost like a human being, right, cultivating to a deity or immortal themselves. Like they're not really human anymore in a lot of
Mm-hmm.
respects. And there's even ways, like in the folklore, you can tell the difference between, like, hey, that's just a regular weasel. And hey, this is this weasel that's eating your chickens right now. Have you seen the color of his eyes? That's not a normal weasel. Don't piss him off. Let him go for the
Yeah,
chickens.
yeah, that's his offering. Let him have it.
And my exposure to Chumashan is, and really, I have to expose how much of a nerd I actually am in my like day-to-day life here, but it's through Magic the Gathering. There are various oblique references to the animal immortals, especially in the set global series Jiangyanggu and Muyanling, which itself is based on the classic of mountains and seas, or the Shanhai Jing.
Okay, so
So,
so one of the people I met actually was very obsessed with the classic of Mountain and Seas and kept on insisting that I read it. Like he was very firm on this point. Like you're a
Like,
foreigner, you have to read the classics,
like
especially
one of
this one,
the
especially
Chumash
this.
practitioners.
He was like, look, 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 and showing me one of the spirits in there, the crying fox. It makes it sound like a baby to attract people in the mountains and then eats them. But he was very insistent on this point, so I think you guys have some good choices right there. It's a long list.
It's like a classic like fairy slash spirit phenomena, right? It's like the crying baby noise in the
mhm.
mountains to try and like grab you. No, I
the
also Key, I do. I'm sorry, I just love that you learn it from like Magic the Gathering. That's so you. How, you
Yeah.
wiping the floor. You like I've watched you wipe the floor with friends of ours in Magic the Gathering. And it's
Mhm.
like, yeah, this is not a mere hobby. This is a profession. You've made some money off this shit.
Yeah,
It's a lifestyle.
games that I play for not insignificant amounts of money from time to time. I was just gonna say with the crying baby demons, love those, really enjoy it, especially when they wake me up at night when I'm making things. But also,
Real Necrostancia up in this house.
oh yeah, laying in a graveyard under a location. Um,
I literally know exactly what you're talking about right now. A
mhm,
story for another time.
for sure. But also the Thai supernatural horror film, was it Medium in translation?
I think
Where
so. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
either the shaman or the medium, but the crying baby demon at the end is the one trick that gets everyone.
The Medium, the 2021 film.
Yes,
Yes, yes, yes.
yes, yes, yes.
I'll make sure I put that in the show notes. Yeah, with the shaman who tries to yep, yeah, yeah, yeah. Gotcha, gotcha, gotcha. Yeah. So good. I just think of like the character Mink and just Mink, like her name constantly being called by every single other character. It's on Shudder, by the way, so please do watch it. It's very good.
Hmm.
I'll have to get onto that then, yeah.
Hmm.
Needless to say, though, long list of media that contains spirits of these kinds that go bump in the night.
Yeah, yeah. Like it's clear that these animal beings are very present in popular culture. I think especially foxes, right? And as we see, there's actually a reason for that. But in the modern day, I think even in the Anglosphere, we have exposure to this media nowadays. And most people of our generation and Zoomers are familiar with Naruto and what have you, especially the younger people. But I think whilst they're relatively new to the Western popular consciousness, they've had a place in China's popular culture, not just in the recent years, but for a very long time. Even before like mass media, TV, and so on, we have stuff like Pu Songling's The Zhai, the Strange Tales from a Chinese studio, and that is literally filled with references to Fox Immortals or other kinds of spirits. And many of these stories, they kind of reflect the fears and desires of the literati and the scholarly class. And that's not to mention things as foundational as the myth of Yu the Great and the Tushan clan. And as well as that, just general folk stories passed on in villages and cities. There's a lot out there.
Absolutely love learning about Pusong Ling's stories. Like you're the one who introduced me to them, and they're incredible. Like if you want like good folk tales and really interesting encounters between people and different immortals and different demons, like it's such a good anthology of work. And it does remind me a lot of the Were Tiger episode, is our third episode, I believe, which we talked a lot about the ways in which stories of female were tigers versus male were tigers, the way that they're punished, the way that they're understood, the way that their shape-shifting prowess is conceived, all reflect the fears and prejudices of those writing these stories, but also evidence a tradition of oral folklore that predates and goes much further beyond merely these stereotypes and these particular anxieties, right? They actually do record important oral histories in addition to being reframed by their authors to convey certain moral codes and understandings and mores.
Yeah, and I mean the gender dynamics even come up in respect to the Immortal family, actually. So that's one of the fascinating things about the way that these stories kind of show the reader's own biases and perspectives, but also can sometimes illuminate the actual practice itself. Now, we're not a pop culture podcast, that's not the main subject today. And what we're going to talk about isn't really that available in English, but whilst we don't focus on popular culture, we do like folk magic and folk beliefs and popular religion. And all these things have a commonality to them that they're things done by the masses, by the people. So popular culture and popular religion often overlap, and they can also differ in many extremes. The Immortal Faith really shows this distinction. The subject of today's talk is a religion known as the Immortal Faith, the veneration of the family of immortals, the Xianjia, the immortal family. And these are animal saints that, much as human beings within Chinese and Taoist cosmology, can cultivate immortality, a kind of sainthood. So these animals are supposed to have achieved the same cultivation that a human being can, in a sense of the higher potential. The term Jia, meaning family, household, home, brings in ancestral connotations as well. Because for most people, that's the role these animal appearing saints take as a kind of second group of ancestors. I've even actually seen one person say that in the south it's ghosts and ancestors, and in the north it's the immortals. Now, that's not strictly true. You'll find ancestral tablets in many northern homes, especially if you have older family members. But it is true that the immortal cult is predominantly, almost entirely until recently, a northern folk religion, much as we might look to Miao influences in the south of China. Chinese religious beliefs are often very regional in nature, as most polytheist cultures tend to be, and even organized religious groups like Orthodox Taoism. Depending where you are, there might be variations in funeral rites and ritual music and so on.
Yeah, I mean, that's the case with any living tradition, right? Like the proof that it's living is that it's going to be different from place to place. It means it's being changed by people to suit their needs, to be influenced by what spirits say when they're down, when they're around, and they're giving proclamations of divination or possession and so on. Like that's something that I think all of us have really hammered home a number of times when it comes to this podcast, right? It's like how things being different in a living culture from one place to another, even from one village to another, from one region to another, like that is proof that it's living. It's a good thing. It doesn't mean that one side are doing it wrong and the other is doing it right. Literature and writing has a way of canonizing things, right? Like a PhD project or an ethnography on a particular tradition, depending on who is being interviewed. When it gets published, it has a way of canonizing those particular perspectives, so that when you encounter differences, you might think, well, maybe these people aren't doing it correctly because this wasn't what I read about. But it's certainly important to remember that Shimexian is a lived practice in northern China, and while it's not solely northern anymore, as you mentioned, it's absolutely something that is going to differ from family to family, individual practice to practice.
Oh yeah, oh yeah. I mean, it's a religion that's really changed since the 60s and 70s in particular, like the revolutionary period. A lot of changes started coming into play around that time as well. And some of those changes are genuinely great. There's kind of this, I wouldn't say more liturgical, but there's a bit more structure to it than what we see during the early days of the religion. But yeah, honestly, like you said, like it's just proof that it's living, it's proof that it's evolving, it's dynamic, it's adapting to the needs of the people that practice it and so on.
Actually, I was going to ask, cultivation is something that comes up a lot in Taoist practices, as I've come to understand that, and as something that you've shown me through your own engagement with these traditions. And it's often a core part of the mission behind a lot of the reason why these organizations come to be, as a way to standardize ways to achieve immortality. But I was curious, since these are animals doing the same thing, and especially 5 different groupings of animals that, to my understanding, are kind of especially capable of cultivation compared to other kinds of animals. Do they attain immortality? Like, do they cultivate in the same way people do, or is it different for them?
Yeah, it's a complicated question because for saints that don't start off as human, it generally is actually a lot more difficult than cultivating to an immortal as a human. And it's not something easy to begin with, right? Like it's a very serious endeavor that most people won't succeed in.
Right.
Humans are blessed with an easier time in comparison. Heaven gave us the gift of reasoning and inheritance. We can pass on scriptures to each other, teach one another. You have the three treasures, the Sanpao, the Taoism, the Tao, the master, the scripture. And we can receive these gifts, we can transmit them to one another. The three spheres of heaven, man, and earth also come to mind here. On the other hand, animals have to suppress the animal nature. They have to overcome formal barriers along the way. They have to attain that state of humanity in particular, and sometimes that is even attained by like a human being recognizing one of these animal spirits as another human. If that person doesn't say, hey, you're a human too, well, they might lose their cultivation and they'll probably kill the guy in a fit of rage as well to punish him for being a dick. But
That's like a little bit like the were-tiger thing, right? Where like the tiger strikes out when it's like the tiger that becomes a human versus the human that becomes a tiger. Like when they get noticed that it's a tiger, like they get mad.
yeah, because they've cultivated, right, like they've overcome that animal nature and they want to be seen as above, I guess, the species, so to speak. Like the same
Hmm
way a human being that becomes an immortal, they're not really human anymore. They're something
hmm
far beyond human.
hmm
And there's one folktale in particular that I think is quite fascinating in this respect. It's probably more recent, but I can't actually tell you its provenance. Standard folklore situation. But essentially, we have the great teacher Taixing Laojun, the deity known as Lao Tzu, the god that incarnated as a human to give the Tao Te Ching to humanity. And he delivers the Tao to man. He grants man the ability to attain immortality and to live in accordance or harmony with the Tao. Now, the godling Bao Tianzun, Taixing Laojing's peer in the Three Pure Ones, or Sanqing, the principal trinity of Taoism, notices that the animals had no means to cultivate the same. They couldn't receive the scriptures, so he granted them the means to cultivate to immortality. He sprinkled over them the golden elixir, the Jin Dan, thus allowing them to attain that same sainthood and proximity to the Tao in their own way that was suitable for them. And that's actually why in some people's practice, Ding Bao Tianzhen, also known under the disguise as the Tongtian sect leader, is considered the highest deity of the immortal family. Though this might be one of the more contemporary additions to the practice, this being popular religion, as we just said, right? Like not the domain of the elite and literati, it's hard to say for certain on many things, especially as far as a historical record goes. But ultimately, you can take the lesson at play here. I think there's a distinction between the animal and the human and how they achieve immortality. I think this notion of distinction between the animal and human world is pretty evident in a lot of practices, esoteric or otherwise. I mean, even within Renaissance philosophy, you have this notion of the chain of being and animals being in a man, but above vegetables and certainly above minerals. And if we assume the hierarchy to be vertical, we see something similar kind of implied here. That said, this idea that nothing is equal is pretty common in Taoism. All things are inferior to the Tao, all things are inferior to heaven, and the 10,000 things are not the equal of one another. Even in the case of animals cultivating, like you said, right, the reason we have these five immortals in particular is because these are the five species of animals who find it easiest to cultivate. They have less to overcome and are, I guess you could say, more suited to attaining heavenly offices one day. On the other hand, some animals like the wolf find it harder to cultivate. In the case of the wolf, it's because its appetite is so strong and it's overbearing. So something like fasting or even going vegetarian if necessary for a period of time, that'd be unthinkable. So wolf demons, relatively common. Wolf immortals, you're not gonna see them too often.
That's really interesting. So I was thinking like, so it's the fox, right? The weasel, the serpent, the hedgehog, and the rat or the mouse. And these are the five animals that have the easiest time cultivating in this particular story, in this view. Is there a particular reason why it's these five? Like, is there something they share in common? Because the first thing that comes to my mind is that they all have like long tails.
Well, I mean, yeah, I think in general the reason varies between them, right? Like they have different reasons behind it. So,
Hmm.
for example, weasels, they're all the immortals are generally seen as yin spirits, but the weasel would be the most yang out of all of them. The Hu family foxes generally tend to be more, I guess, balanced in a lot of respects. They're quite level-headed, they're quite rational. They have the easiest time by far, which is why they're generally the leadership as well. These serpents, a bit more complicated. It's more difficult for them, but they're also very powerful naturally. So
Those are
they,
my
they
boys.
for the mice and the hedgehogs. Well, hedgehogs are slow, contemplative, right? They're protective, also very closely associated with healing, as we're going to talk about. But I think that contemplative nature serves them quite well in the quest for immortality.
Hmm.
For the mouse, I mean, they're everywhere, right? Like you can't go anywhere. There's the old thing you're told when you're a kid, like you're never more than 3 feet away from a rat.
Hmm.
The
Yeah.
So they see everything, they hear everything, and so they have access to all the knowledge that other animals don't.
Gotcha, gotcha. Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I'm just thinking about the mice that live in temples, right? And listen to all the chanting and the scripture being recited.
Yeah, I mean exactly. I mean the temple's a place where, it's quite often open. There's not necessarily a door that shuts. In some in some cases, there's food offerings left out. So yeah, I mean definitely.
Hmm. So early on, you mentioned differences, right? So, like, how does the popular depiction of animal spirits in China differ from this particular practice? Because we talked about foxes being seductive and mischievous and vampiric, even. How does that differ from the way that the fox immortals are understood here?
Yeah, so here I think in particular, like where you have, like you said, like that erotic or dangerous depiction in the Lao Jai and modern day animation and novels. And that can be true in the case of like Hu Yao and Hu Jing or fox demons. But in the case of the Northern Immortal family, where the majority of the immortals are usually quasi-saints, earth immortals, more often we actually see them desexualized. They're elderly, grey-haired, with beards, and they wear the very formal uniforms of Qing dynasty officials. And that's the last dynasty of China of Manchurian origin. Ultimately, though, it's pretty different from the seductress image presented in the media in respect to the Hu family, at least up north where the majority of these saints appear. Interestingly, southern China is a bit of a different story, in my experience anyway. But it's also hard to gauge how long the fox cult has actually been present in the south. The Orthodox fox immortal lady, whose mythos is directly related to the Tianshi's palace, has a huge cult today. and still retains a lot of these associations. But that's another practice entirely, and not really the subject of today's talk, despite being a very well-known fox deity who's very popular in Singapore, Taiwan, and naturally also in China itself, where she's installed in Long Hushan's shrine. But I think another area we might discuss popular perception is the notion that the immortals are demons, Hu Yao, etc. And there are definitely fox demons, weasel demons, and so on out there. Some of them are well intentioned, right? The word Yao or Yao, which we translate to demon, although it does usually have a negative connotation, does have room for ambiguity to it. Though many of them are actually malicious, so don't be dumb. But the exact nature of the immortal family is sometimes a subject for debate. It's a lot of Orthodox Taoist sources prescribe the cult of the immortal family as demonic, for example. The idea is that these immortals come down and steal the essence of blood of their disciples or incense offerings in temples. And it's also denigrated as a practice done by scammers and frauds for reasons that we'll see soon when we talk about how the immortal faith is actually practiced and who does it. Another common critique is that even when well intentioned, these aren't earth immortals but mountain spirits or spirits of the woods and the fields. But for those practicing, they wouldn't agree with these comments. They're immortals, not quite heavenly immortals, but terrestrial ones, what we might call a quasi-saint, and on a road to attaining that immortality to further promotion. That means they're bound by their own rules, their own hierarchies, and the reasons that they come to help human beings is for their cultivation to attain and gather merit, so they can be promoted and gain rank and become participants in the celestial bureaucracy. Also because in the process of cultivation, they've also developed a good character. It doesn't deny the existence of the more demonic elements. For I'll be real, some disciples have encountered were clearly not all there. And they probably do have demons masquerading as immortals in their skin. But I think the key takeaway here is that for the mass general perception of the immortal faith is suspicion and caution, as is often the case for mediumistic cults.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, most of my sources didn't use their real names when we talked.
Right. This reminds me a little bit of Kimanda and the divide between like lowercase e Eshu, the spirit, and capital E Eshu, the deity, and the suspicion of these spirits as crossroads beings, as tricksters, as prone to aggression and all kinds of other things, contrasted against the deity who is also deified accident itself. So there's this kind of suspicion to a lot of these cults, and especially because they don't grant a head spirit the way that other traditions like voodoo or lukumi would. You know, with the exception of Kimanda Kongo, which does actually investigate head medicine. But at the same time, there's this understanding that people are going to be drawn to it for their own reasons and sometimes forced into it because they were possessed by an issue. So they have no choice but to learn how to be a trance medium. It's already happening to them. But they can certainly be looked down upon and seen as also ridden by bad or negative spirits and some, depending on your particular mediumistic understanding, right? You know, you still have a lot of Kardecian influences of like, what does it mean for a spirit to progress? What does it mean for a spirit to cultivation isn't the word that's used, right? But like progression and elevation certainly are. Which the tradition that I'm from doesn't see these spirits as in need of elevation. It sees our relationship to them as something to be trained and to be disciplined and mastered. So it's more how they inhabit us that will show our character as opposed to the other way around. But nevertheless, you can absolutely still see how spirits can be nevertheless a negative influence on us if we are not prepared to confront our own inner demons.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the Weasel family in particular kind of has this reputation of bringing that emotionality. They're very extreme in nature, and so I think when a disciple has a strong Weasel family behind them, that person can become quite erratic in their behavior. But like ultimately, it's a matter of being able to control those impulses, understanding that that's us having difficulty dealing with them potentially. I think, yeah, it's something you don't want to bring up at the family function without knowing how the waters are, so to speak. And that doesn't mean everyone sees it negatively. There are people who don't have immortals but respect the immortal faith, go to see disciples to see things or help with their troubles in life. But I think one thing that's important really is that despite practitioners tending to see the immortals as these quasi-saints, they don't give them the highest seat on the hierarchy. Generally speaking, they're subordinated to their own hierarchy, but also to the local deities. The city god, for example, often plays a major role in that. The notion at hand is that whilst the upper immortals, or Shangxian, like the three pure ones, the Jade Emperor, They're distant, high, mighty, above. The immortal family, on the other hand, is with us. They want to work, act with their hands as messengers for the upper immortals and attain merits and good deeds. They aren't gods with a capital G, but they are the messengers and agents for the gods, in other words. And some of the most common ones are the Black Old Lady, the Queen Mother of the West and her daughters, the Jade Emperor, and Ling Bao Tianzhen, as well as the Old Medicine Kings.
Something that I'm kind of wondering about as the messengers and agents and emissaries of these particular deities, are they're given affinities of like one immortal family to a particular deity as their envoy? So I guess I'm thinking about it in terms of like lore almost that extends from MTG, where like the card Ninetail White Fox is based on a sketch of a fox immortal that is literally called the companion of the Queen Mother of the West.
So the Queen Mother of the West has a long relationship with the Immortals, although she's becoming a bit less common to see in the modern day. She's still very prominent, and historically is one of the primary matrons over the Immortals. Keep in mind that it is in her garden that the Pages of Immortality can be found, and one of the two major festivals, actually, the day one goes out, so to speak, that the Immortal family kind of descends and possesses people, is on her feast as well. That said, I wouldn't say the immortals are usually associated or assigned under specific deities in a context that disciples engage them, like in the context of this practice. Rather, they're under the heads of their specific families, like Hu Santai. A lot of halls will likely focus on a particular group of deities as well, such as the Vision Lady or the Old Black Lady of the Northeast or the Big Dipper Star Gods. But generally speaking, like no one's saying that these spirits don't have these relationships, but they're usually a bit more personal and in the context of what's being done in the hall. You won't usually see it too often. If that is the case, it's kind of probably dependent on that particular person's family or immortal family, I guess you could say.
Gotcha.
One of the things I think that's worth keeping in mind is that the religion really kind of found its footing during the Qing dynasty, and there were definitely isolated cults preceding it, but it was specifically during the Qing dynasty that we see the immortal faith really began to flourish and grow. That's why when we look at the hagiographies for certain immortals, such as Grandmaster Hu III, one of the most important spirits within the pantheon, we see constant references to Nahachi, the Kangxi Emperor, and so on. The immortal faith is really rooted in northern China from the Dongbei region to Hunan province. And in its earliest days, it was very prominent in Shandong, where actually the third Grand Master and third Grand Lady were considered humans. Hunan and the northern capital, Beijing, as well as Shaanxi, also paid tribute to the immortals. But as always, geopolitics come into play. During the 18th century, we see the Chuan Guangdong, a mass migration of Han Chinese from northern China into the territories of Manchuria, the Dongbei region, or in English, the northeast. And they brought the immortal faith with them. And eventually, I can't say when this became commonplace, they started to appropriate local Manchurian customs and their veneration to these immortals, in particular adopting the aesthetics of Manchu shamanism. Manchu shamanism being something that David Shure has written about extensively. And I do recommend you folks check out his text on North Asian shamanism. I just want to quickly add as well that one of the things you'll see today is people saying it's a Northeastern religion, which isn't strictly true. And there are some people that are very enthusiastic about that particular perspective. So I appreciate him shouting me out and correcting me on that one because I was being taken in by that approach at the time.
I remember when you reached out to David, he is absolutely brilliant, and his book that recently came out, Spirit Voices, The Mysteries and Magic of North Asian Shamanism, is one that we've read and loved, and one that I think we've recommended on the podcast before as well. It's excellent for tracing the different Northern Asian lineage of spirituality, as well as noting the important differences between modern commercialized understandings of shamanism, especially through the promulgation of what is known as New Age core shamanism, and what this term means in more traditional societies, especially with how non-consensual and involuntary these initiations are. But it makes sense to me that as Manchurian aesthetics became incorporated the Chumash, some people came to see its origins in the Northeast, as you were saying. And it's inevitable that things will appropriate each other's aesthetics, right? Like I mentioned Kibanda earlier, but like what a mishmash of various not just Bantu Congolese, but Fombe, Jeje, Nago, Yoruba, many different West African tribes, plus European diabolism and Kardecian spiritism and indigenous Brazilian forms of magic and worship and so on. Like so many different kinds of things borrowing from each other based on geography and based on populations, right? So it's going to happen for sure. It's just a matter of tracing the actual history of things that can get a little muddy.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's kind of inevitable in these cases, right? Where everything kind of just gets adapted and blended in together. And there's quite often, like in the case of Kimbandra, probably the Congolese elements. I'm not really from a position to speak on that. But there's always that kind of core, right? And then everything gets added on and adapted to it as well. And in the case of Chimashan, it's specifically the Han Chinese elements that took on these other influences, mostly from the Northeast, I guess, but also from Korea as well. And how deep those go, that's definitely up for debate. But ultimately, I guess the Han influence is quite evident. And especially we see that when we talk about things like repaying yin debt or using Daliu Ren, for example, to divine.
I was really happy when I saw the mention of Dali Ren as a big lover of Chiman and similar divination systems. So I was wondering if you could actually get into like Dali Ren in the context of the Immortal family cult.
Yeah, so Daliu Ren is obviously a very intensive system of divination, much like Qi. You have everything from the Wuxing five elements, the heavenly stems, to the Zhao Yi involved. And it does get pretty heavy-handed. It's astrology in steroids in a lot of ways. But in the context of the Immortal family, it's actually one of the first divination systems that someone uses as like a kind of, hey, you want to have a technical method on hand as well for when they're not possessing you or when they're not here themselves. So that comes into play then. And a lot of practitioners will even just specifically do like more technical approaches rather than engaging in possession at all. But in the context of the immortal faith, yeah, because one of the main things that a disciple does is divine for people, like it's really one of the key parts of the job is divination. It plays one of the major roles in respect to methods. Not every single practitioner is going to use it, but it's one of the most like common, I suppose you could say. Probably the only thing more common would be the standard, 8 characters, as well as the incense divination. That's probably the most well-known and associated, like, technical method, so to speak. Although one person actually did say to me, like, he thinks incense divination isn't strictly what was happening. It was more so that they lit incense when they called the immortals and people associated that with the divination. But who knows, really? That one's a interesting thought, though. I quite like it.
Incense divination here being like looking at the way that the sticks, like what are the patterns that the smoke makes?
Kind of, yeah. I mean, it's quite complicated. Ideally, it's not even you looking at the incense, it's the immortals. But
Mm-hmm.
so you want to look at the brightness, you want to look at the ash, you want to look at where the incense head is because it is using sticks. So, like, is this head higher than the other one is an important feature.
Right.
You want to look at the smoke, if it rises, if it falls, what color is it, how bright the flame is, how dark it is. Did the incense light easily when you started? There's a lot that goes into it. It's a really good method, though. I love it.
Mm-hmm.
So, returning to what we were saying earlier as well, in respect to the North Asian shamanistic influence and so on, the core is quite distinct. There's definitely very strong Han elements involved, as we said. And David Sher, who we just mentioned, did call it a kind of light shamanism, and I would agree with that. We do find similar circumstances in southern Maoshan, for example, and where many of the folk religions in Yunnan province and so on meet with Han Chinese religions and the two kind of intertwine and intercept one another, mutually appropriating one another. But based on my lacking, admittedly, understanding of the exact dynamics here, the integration isn't as strong up north as it can be down south. It's kind of a very broad overview of the history and some contextualizing pieces. I could talk more about the history, and there's a wide array of textual sources. Xiaofei Kang's Cult of the Fox really focuses on the immortal faith as it was practiced historically during the Qing dynasty. And a book by Harvard University Press called Alien Kind discusses the literati and their influence. But I don't want to rehash stuff here. I want to talk about things I've encountered mostly by talking to people who do it. This isn't going to be the deep, intimate secrets of the practice. Today's episode is really focused on the kind of fundamental things that anyone involved, even tangentially, kind of just knows. But at the same time, I need to caution you because this subject does have a lot of information as a dubious origin, as a lot of misinformation presented out there. So we want to be wary of that in particular. Generally, I'm very careful when approaching these topics because we want to ensure accuracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, I've already had slip ups, right, where I'm like, oh, it's like that, and then I find out, no, 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 and then there's arguments, right? Because it's regional, so there are differences. When I say arguments, I don't mean I argue with people. I mean these guys argued with each other,
Yeah,
that
yeah,
kind of
yeah.
thing.
Because you've done a fair amount of legwork and like meeting with disciples and actually speaking to them about the tradition and doing like primary source research essentially, like ethnographic stuff.
Yeah, and it's difficult, right? Because my Chinese is not fluent. That's probably clear by my pronunciation. If a native speaker wants to hold a vocal conversation with me, then it's like Jian Lao Tai. I'm not going to get anything. I usually have to get by with a dictionary at the current moment in time and hope that everything will be written. Thankfully, WeChat does have a pretty good speech to text function for the moments that a conversation turned into a phone call.
But you know what? Your studies are going great. I mean, like pretty much every day, Assault and I begin our workday with language practice, right? Like we hop on whatever app or whatever textbook that we're learning out of, and we try and knock out a lesson or two before we start like our work. And you've been really crushing it with memorizing characters and being, trying to be as literate as you are in terms of being able to speak and understand. So like you've been really doing well. I'm very proud of you.
Thank you, thank you. Honestly, I mean, it's something that is pretty enjoyable to be doing on the commute, you know?
Hmm.
It's, but yeah, I think language skills are just immeasurably important in anything, right? Especially when it comes to practicing something that's foreign. Like we need to be able to engage with it directly in the language that it was originally practiced to the best of our ability.
Yeah, and also just showing our respect to the ancestry traditions, right? And the living people who carry it forward.
Exactly, exactly. Like even if you get past the liturgical elements, it's just something you want to do.
Hmm.
I think in possession-based cults as well, there's a immediately practical use to it because what happens when a spirit comes down and starts speaking a language that you otherwise wouldn't understand because that's what they're kind of used to in the template.
Yeah, 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 exactly. It's hard when you're at like a giro or a misa espiritual or something like that, and spirits mount and then they don't speak the language that you know. There's usually interpreters around, right? Like some people who will be able to interpret for you if the spirit shows up to give you a message. But I think it's always better to just come prepared. So I would say that definitely in the case of misas, knowing Portuguese is help with Spanish. Although spirits often don't come speaking the Spanish that you're used to, right? It'll be some kind of Creole. So you make do with what you can. But definitely, that's a really good point, Key. When spirits show up, they're not necessarily going to speak English. Even if the mount or the horse knows a certain languages, that the spirit will be able to speak anything the mount speaks, but doesn't mean they want to.
Yeah, which is talking of like mediumistic stuff. This is also a mediumistic religion. Not always in the explicit sense, but usually the immortals come down. They possess the medium who drinks baijiu and smokes, gives advice, receives offerings, and heals people, draws talismans, and so on. They're organized into armies, encampments, sects, with different officers and alike taking different posts within the family. And the disciple is usually under the direct order of the immortal known as their sect leader or hall master, other times known as their leading master. And this is the immortal that acts as the kind of patron or guide and organizes the other immortals within the hall. So each practitioner is essentially the medium between the immortals and the community that they live within. The practitioner helps the immortals by acting as an agent, just as they might act as the agents of the upper immortals, and this is done by divination, Taoist methods, medicine, and so on. And a lot of them practitioners have different specialties, right? Like for some people, medicine, 13 ghost needles, that kind of stuff, that's where they'll specialize. Other people will be specializing in divination, oracles, that kind of thing. But it's not something you really choose to do. You don't really get a choice whether you practice it or not. Whether you catch the incense or pass the incense, you need the requisite fate, the Xian Yuan, to be considered a disciple or junior horse. The Ima is the term usually used. Usually this is ancestral. Someone in the family had it, or someone in the family saved an animal who attained immortality later. Sometimes they see you walking and go, hey, this guy, he can be a vehicle for us. 为他能使 what men do, and they just happen to think you'd be suited to the job. But it's not a simple process. There are a number of omens first that precede everything, and usually there are particular traits that a disciple can identify, quite particular at times even. So someone with a family that has a lot of weasel saints will have different traits to someone who has more serpent saints than is typical. And these omens often occur during the various tribulations, both tests and also the immortals, basically doing surgery on the body to make you suitable for possession. And these usually cease once one becomes a disciple. So yes, this is one of the reasons why it gets difficult reputations. The immortals torture or grind, or mold the disciple into being capable. I do know the omens. I'm not going to say them publicly because I don't think it'd be a good idea to do that. So I suppose you got to do a little bit of gatekeeping at the incense gate, as the practice can often be called.
Okay, I love the very spirit-packed nature of the lack of choice in this. I think it's very topical considering the episode that we just did on spirit pacts. I totally see why sometimes it's seen as like a kind of like a shamanism light tradition, given what you mentioned about these kind of omens, about the way people are identified, about the way the spirits can essentially just possess you and take you and force you into this role of being the disciple and kind of turn your life upside down until you accept it. It seems to be a parallel with some like traditions of spirit sickness, right? But something that I was thinking of was like, man, it is such a good idea not to share the omens that other disciples have revealed to you. I say this as someone who has to be extremely cautious about sharing particular omens of traditions that I'm privy to, that I participate in, that I have initiation in, or that I don't at all have initiation into, but I just know of what these things are culturally, like in the Balkans, for example. Because, if you share it, people will be like, well, that's what I was doing all along, right? Like people will play act and convince themselves, like not necessarily maliciously, but they will. I mean, there's always the bandwagoners who will happily do that, but there's definitely people who will convince themselves that this was happening to them all along, even when our memories are never as good as we think they are, right? So we can always imagine that difficult or traumatic spirit experiences in the past were these things, when this is a very specific tradition with a very specific hierarchy of spirits that have very particular ways of manifesting themselves. So I think I think you're right to hold off on that, but I do think it's really cool that you know this and that you've done so much research by not just reading all the written material. There is a very few English sources there are, but spending countless hours actually talking to people through Google translated WeChat conversations and the Mandarin that you do know.
Yeah, the dictionary. It's fun. But I think in respect to the gatekeeping, not a popular word nowadays maybe, but
Don't hate the
practitioners,
keeper, hate the gate.
yeah.
I do like that the tradition Chimeshan is sometimes referred to as the incense gate.
Yeah, which is also another name for temple gates, actually, especially like the backdoor temple gate.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, I mean, it's important to avoid people retroactively giving meanings and stuff because the immortals don't play. And most people don't want to end up being mediums, especially for this kind of practice where, it will become your entire life. It's not an easy life, honestly. The social issues aside, it makes things like tribulations for love, money, wealth, career. Oh, you got a high-paying tech job? Fuck you. Now you make a living busting your ass for incense money and divining for people because the only way you'd listen and accept the will of heaven was if you lost your material success.
Mm-hmm.
So, yeah, not something most people actually want, to the point where one of the most common things that a disciple will get is, hey, you've got the immortals on you. Like, no, I don't want them. I don't want them. How do I stop this? You can't. It's like, no, no, please, I actually can't do this for a living. And like, okay, I'm going to tell you this. This is kind of a reduced method where you won't have any obligations outside of giving these offerings. They'll give you money. They'll protect your household and your family. They won't come down and possess you, but you have to keep this up. That would be installing Balgia shrines, which usually aren't actually meant for that, but it's one of the like negotiations you can make if you really don't want to do this. But like that's the thing, right? Like people don't want to have to do this for a living.
Mm. If they need something, it's a common magic thing, right? Like if you want the benefits of it, you'd go to the medium or the specialist or the diviner or someone who does that for a living, but you don't necessarily want to engage it yourself. It's like the case with a lot of like African traditional practices, right? People are happy to hire those who are in these cults to do what they need to do, but they don't want to be involved necessarily because they know it's going to be a lot of money and a lot of time and a lot of effort and just dedicating your whole life to these spirits. Really, if they're possessing you, sometimes you just want it off you and then leave. But if there's no coming back and you just have to be initiated at that point and you have to be trained, then it's usually the the last thing you wanted, really, as opposed to occultists to go out seeking these kinds of things because they want more spirits and they want more traditions to practice, which, all of us are certainly in that camp, right? But it's definitely not the typical way of going about it.
Yeah, it's
Like even when the three of us are drawn to things, I'm not saying like we go out and hunt these things, you know what I mean? Like we definitely pursue the stuff that we're drawn to and the things that these spirits show up and kind of force us into it anyway. But it's definitely a mutual seeking of knowledge and power. But for most people, that's really not the way to go about it. In fact, it's a very strange approach to go about it as an occultist, as opposed to a layperson who's aware of it and would benefit from it if they needed it, if they want to hire somebody, but they're not looking to do it themselves.
yeah, it's kind of one of those practices where if you don't have the spirits, even if you seek out transmission, for example, and find a teacher, it without the spirits there already, you can't really receive it from someone else just because you went to someone who does have it. It's a bit weird like that sometimes. I think there's a lot of practices that are like that, right? Like you either have it or you don't. And with the immortals, it's kind of a situation of you need to have it. And usually that's through passing incense or receiving it from someone else.
Mm-hmm.
Well, receiving transmission from someone else.
What does transmission entail here? Like, what does that mean?
So usually what will happen is you go to a diviner or a disciple, I guess, and they will look at your Xianwan or your immortal fate. The most common method for that is incense. They'll ask you some questions. They'll look for the particular omens in particular. And during the divination, there should also be some particular omens coming up through that. That there are particular methods that you know. And they'll say, hey, what spirits are on this person? For example, is there a lot of Hu family? Is there a lot of Yellow family? Is there a lot of Willow family? That kind of situation. And then from there, the transmission isn't as intensive as it is in, say, Orthodox Taoism or Southern Maoshan. But usually there's some kind of ceremony involved. But really, the transmission is being passed on the methods. It's more so about receiving the actual practical procedures and formalities. The initiation, so to speak, that one's a bit tricky because usually what will happen is your teacher will take you to raise the hall list. He will pass on, or you will pass on, depends, with his supervision. The names of the immortals that are in your family, you'll build a hall list and the immortals' names will be raised up on the shrine. And that'll kind of be like, this is the registry of the soldiers in my encampment. That kind of is kind of like the centerpiece. There's also a number of steps that some people say are important, some people don't, like worshipping the seven stars of the Big Dipper. And there's a few others, breaking the barriers and so on. But Kaimar as well, opening the horse, is quite often done. But some people think, hey, that's not necessary. That's a new ritual. We don't do that. It's a regional practice, so the exact details of transmission are going to vary extensively from place to place, from practice to practice.
For sure, for sure. That makes a lot of sense.
So yeah, that's the Immortal Disciple. We talked about it a little bit, a tiny bit, nothing too much, but what about the Immortals, right? That's what people are really here to talk about.
Yeah, give us the animals.
Yeah, so we mentioned there are five families, sometimes more, sometimes less, but usually the five great immortals are the primary recipients. And they are the fox, the weasel, the snake, the rat, and the hedgehog. But in modern day, the four beams are also quite popular, and that's the fox, weasel, snake, and ghosts.
So it's a quick question about the five pillars versus the four beams. What would kind of lead to the determination of one or the other? Is it just regional variance, which immortals people have on them as they open a hall, things like this?
So the four beams are a more modern concept. I'm actually going to talk about that in a little bit. But essentially, the four beams came about probably in the 60s and 70s for a very particular reason. Usually, a disciple would actually have just all five families with them, as well as some ghosts around them, because of the nature of their work. But today the four beams have become more popular, I think, especially around like the Beijing area. It's a lot more common. But yeah, in general, the five immortals are kind of the more traditional perspective, I suppose you could say. Actually, if you want to go like talk about traditionally it was usually just one or two immortals. Like it wasn't the entire encampment, armies and sects and stuff like that. Even that's modern. Although I think one of the innovations where things developed in a way that are quite beneficial, so to speak, and a way that the spirits kind of changed the way they approach people. And another way that we can divide them as well, actually, and it's quite important to really, is the difference between Baojia or family guardians and Martian, horse immortals. So the former are kind of personal immortal or saint. They protect the family, the household, you, whether that's because they owe the family a debt of some kind or one of your ancestors. Maybe your granddad said, look after us and I'll feed you rice every month, or something else to a passing immortal. The Baljian generally look after the household. They're quite literally adoptive ancestors, really. They take it into the family and who look after it in return, often acting as wealth gods. And much as the Kitsune Mochi in Japan sometimes, especially a few generations ago, having these Baojia immortals was kind of risky because you might see you're honoring them. You might see the tablet in your room, the usual way that people build shrines to them and think, hey, that's why I lost my harvest. His immortal took it from me to nourish his family.
I love that. It's so similar to the Kitsune Mochi in Japan, the fox possessors, the sometimes lay monks, sometimes families that have a fox spirit, and then they get possessed by them or they wield them in sorcery, and then in time they pass it on to somebody else. But they were often greatly persecuted because, as with many situations, all the way from Portugal and who owns the Livro de São Cipriano, who has the Book of Saint Cyprian, to who is alleged to be the vampire or the witch or the sorcerer in many different traditions in Eastern Europe and the Balkans, right? It's a who has more wealth, who has more apparent fertility in their farm, in their land. That's the person accused of witchcraft, right? So in that way, the person who seems to be doing more well in terms of their rural prosperity is accused of being somebody who owns the kitsune spirit and being the kitsune mochi.
Yeah, and quite often when they don't have anything to do with that at all as well, it's
Yeah,
quite
exactly. Because it's the grass is greener, right? Sort of situation, right? Like that person must be a werewolf. That's why their cows are doing better. That's why they're the one that didn't get struck by a natural disaster, or they're not having the particular disease or illness that's spreading around, right? It has to be for that reason, or the reason I'm getting it is because they took my fertility, my fortune, right? They stole it or vampirized it, and that's why they're doing so well and I'm suffering.
It's a lot like even the Drache families that we mentioned in the Shrat episode, where
Mm-hmm.
like it's kind of the same narrative the world over. It's like, oh, this misfortune occurred. It must be due to this particular spirit. And the question of was it actually that spirit or was it misfortune is kind of an ambiguous thing because it can be both.
Yeah, absolutely. And not to mention, I mean, accusations of witchcraft and magic often occur in small, intimate, familial settings, right, where everyone knows each other, and it's the intimacy and the heightened trust, and also therefore lack of trust, that makes these accusations all the more pernicious and all the more difficult to bear. So I think in this situation, it just goes to show precisely why you might be seen as harboring a special familiar, like a kitsune or a drache or something similar, that is able to siphon these kinds of things for you if you happen to be doing well.
Yeah, and it's also interesting in respect to like the I guess the private nature of these kind of so-called like familial spirits, right? Because they're not serving the community. It's more so, hey, his family's benefiting, hey, he himself is benefiting, but there's no communal work, so to speak, involved in these like practices. And it's the same here with Baljian, actually. It's kind of akin to a lay practice for the immortal family almost. You still need the requisite fate. You still need the Balgia or family guardians around, because if you don't, you're just feeding ghosts and demons rather than them. But generally, it's something that occurs because it occurs with this protective spirit. It's like ancestors in that sense. Great granddad isn't going to help some total stranger. You're not going to get a great granddad to ask, "Hey, why is David from across the street? Why is his grass not growing?" Right?
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to go ask your great granddad that, but you might ask him, "Hey, my cousin's not doing too well. Is there anything you can do to help him out?" Right? Because he's going to go out his way to help his descendants, and it's the kind of same thing with the Bao. Their immediate focus is the family, the house that they're a part of, especially the person who's giving them their offerings regularly. You just got to make sure to take care of them in that sense. And usually, the family guardian immortal is a fox or a weasel because these are the more social, the ones who engage with people the most. These are the immortals that are very active in the mortal world who tend to be out and about as they do things.
Hmm.
It is quite distinct though from the horse immortal, the Martian, because this isn't just one or a few immortals, it's entire armies, battalions. The immortal sect leader arrives and they start recruiting other immortals. They establish a sect, a faction, and the practitioner becomes the disciple, the junior horse of the sect leader, also known as the leading master, helping them reach the world and attain merit, destroying and driving out ghosts and demons, healing the sick, revealing the needed information through oracles, and so on. And this Persian is a specialist, a practitioner, and a vehicle of the immortal family. They basically work for the immortals. And they're the main focus today because Bao is usually pretty simple. There isn't too much to say. Usually you make a tablet, there's no ritual needed, just draw it on wood or paper, maybe the right size with good writing. And you make offerings on the requisite days, usually the 1st and 15th of the month, the major lunar calendar days for offerings. Well, following accompanying taboos, some of which are pretty obvious, like not facing the tablet towards the bathroom. The immortal family, when it's setting out the Hortimals, that's when things get a bit more complicated. And how much of that is modern innovation contrasted with the relative simplicity of this religion in the Qing dynasty and even the early Republican period is definitely worth considering. Some of these innovations are pretty nice. Some I think might be a bit questionable in origin, but for the most part, you'll find it's quite a flourishing and living practice with things like the hall list and naming the immortals present in the hall, the incense burners, and all the services you'd expect from a folk practitioner in China, like we were saying earlier, right? Like yin debt repayments are a big part of it in particular. And all of these growths are natural developments, and I wouldn't characterize them as necessarily diversions from the core of the practice.
Can you run down quickly like what actually a yin debt repayment is?
Yeah, so this is probably one of the most common ceremonies you'll see performed in China for people that follow popular religion or Taoism. And essentially, the idea is set forth that when we're born, we borrow money from the underworld officials, and we also accrue debt in our daily lives by our actions. So you need to ritually repay that debt. And there's a few ways to calculate it and a few ways to repay it, ranging from the relatively simple to the pretty complex. And usually it's fairly expensive because, as in all things, you need to spend money to make money. And if you killed someone, including with magic, then you're paying even more as well. But the actual way is ironic. Like I said, right, spending money to make money, you're quite literally burning paper joss money. Like, and a lot of it, oh man, the
Gotcha.
mountains you will see in some places is pretty obscene. Like, I'm talking stacks of gold joss paper, the size of a person with incense sticks inside, weird shaped cornucopias, and that kind of thing. It's very, very intensive process, really.
Having participated in a number of those kinds of things in Chinatown, in the city in which we live, it's quite something to see all like the paper, like the golden sheen paper folded ingots being burned, as well as outfits for the dead, like clothes and shoes and so on, and lots and lots and lots of paper money.
Yeah, especially for Qingming, like you'll see clothes being burnt for the ancestors and so on as well. So, I mean, in reality, a lot of money just gets burnt in this, and I don't mean literally, I mean like the Joss money, because
Hmm.
even exorcism, you'll be burning like Joss gold ingots. Yeah, there's a lot, but it's also one of the kind of fun things about Chinese religion. You get set fire to stuff a lot.
Well, the spirits have their own use for money and use it for liquid capital as a thing in the underworld.
And when the universe is a bureaucracy, what makes bureaucracy's wheels turns, right?
Oh my God, the sheer amount of I was researching like stove god stuff with you recently. It's like one of the most popular forms of Chinese folk religion is venerating the kitchen god, right? The god of the stove. And the rituals that I saw for various festivals, especially preceding Mid-Autumn Harvest Festival and Chinese New Year, being where you bribe the stove god. And like, remember how many times I gave you all these sweets and all this money and all these things, and I burned all these extra incense sticks for you, and I gave you all these extra fruits. Remember when I did those things? Yeah, so make sure when you write a report for me to heaven, remember to gloss over the little problems that I have, and really amp up, really highlight in this report how good I've been.
Yeah, he's gotta big us up to the Jade Emperor, right? Like you wanna look good in front of heaven. It's always the ideal situation to be in.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about this in the last episode, right? But like the bribing of spirits is such a fascinating, cross-cultural phenomenon in all our traditions. One thing I know you're about to get into the five immortals. You've mentioned the fox and the weasel having a particular reputation of being a good leader or being a bit more level-headed and so on. I was curious, what are the main differences between the five? Especially since some of them seem to have like named ancestors within them, like you mentioned, like a grandmother who and or like a third grand lady who and so on.
Yeah, so the five families have their own leaders, so there's a leader for each of them. And these are kind of the senior leadership, right? So third Grandmaster Hu and his wife, third Grand Lady Hu, or Hu Santai and Hu Santai Nai. They're the leaders of the Hu family and the Immortal family in general. You also have, for example, Huang Ertai, who's the leader of the Weasel family, Grandmaster Huang II. And these generational numbers are because of the, I guess, genial relations of the spirits themselves. So, yes, there is a second and first Grandmaster Hu. Um, there are conflicting accounts why they're not the leaders. One of the more popular ones, which might be more modern, says that they essentially died during battle. Whether or not that's actually the case, I've seen people argue both ways. I'm not going to put my foot into the ring there. But the leadership, these are like the senior leaders. For individual disciples, you'll have a different leader who leads like your particular weasels, your particular serpent family, for example. Like that'll be the sect leader for that particular family, who are then subordinated to like the leading master who leads all five of the families in your hall. And it's kind of like your patron or main sponsor. In respect to the individual differences, so let's start with the foxes because they're the most well known, they're the leadership, and we call them Hu, which is essentially the same as the actual word for fox. The main difference is when you write it, because it's not the same character. The character you use instead is actually the same as the popular surname. I think a very well known example might be Hu Jintao, the previous paramount leader of China, right?
Mhm.
And this word is associated with northerners and can also be pejorative to mean barbarian. There's also one common etymology in specifically the Immortal Faith, where bandits in the north were known as Huzi, beards, and the Immortal Faith is itself related to bandit culture. Sometimes because the bandits who pretend to be disciples to defraud others, and sometimes because they were actually sincere believers.
I like that it's dipping into almost a 19th century Chinese version of narco saints with their kind of historic associations with aiding criminality in the region.
Yeah, I mean it's not necessarily like well, I mean, yeah, I mean I guess in some respects, like today people would probably not agree with the idea that they are, but I mean that's even the case with a lot of I guess criminal religion, right? It's like you have on one hand the police and the criminals are praying to the same God.
Mhm.
And to a point, that's one of the like complicated things I talked about earlier, because the bandit culture influences the four beams and stuff. That actually comes from some of it anyway, comes from a revolutionary opera called Taking Tiger Mountain with Strategy. And the same opera has a group of bandits that organize their gang by the four beams and the eight pillars, which is how a lot of contemporary halls organize their halls. That isn't quite the true meaning of the term as it was originally used, though. The term four beams and eight pillars is itself taken from Buddhism and actually refers to the stability of the immortal encampment. But a lot of practitioners today use it to describe a division of labor amongst the troops, and will use it in that capacity. And it's probable that the spirits have even in those cases adapted to that way of organization, right? But
Hmm.
returning to foxes before I get off track talking about Chinese bandit culture and religion.
Which I know, I'm obsessed that you know so much about it. Like this is many late night conversations in bed have actually been about this.
Like
I love how well versed you are in Chinese bandit culture.
only really the early Republican period, but that's because it's just difficult, very difficult period of history, but genuinely like some very interesting characters, we'll say. Yeah, so we got off track again, but it was for a good cause. So the Hu family, like we've said before, are generally the leaders of the Immortals. They're also the ones who find the easiest time attaining immortality alongside the Yellow family. And they're generally kind of famed for their intellect and capability. They're the administrators, the officers, and usually dignified, handsome, or beautiful. They carry themselves with gravitas and are also renowned for their scholarship. One of the areas where popular culture did get things right, actually, is in the depiction of the Lahu, or the old fox, essentially grey-haired old foxes that love to talk to priests about scriptures and so on, and acting as benefactors to their friends. And the weasels are the yellow family, Huang. They're pretty fun, often taking the form of youths, young lads, and generally the most yang of the immortal family, who are usually seen as yin spirits by non-practitioners and even by some practitioners. They're loud, chatty. They don't really care about the consequences of their words, but they don't ever forgive a grudge either, and you don't want to lie to them, as they're pretty upfront, so they expect the same from people. And the yellow family brings extremes with them, like the element of wood they're often associated with, flourishing, growing, and expanding. And they're also the immortals that like to pretend that they're the Jade Emperor, Neja, or other similar figures. Usually in Xianjia, people don't consider these gods as capable of possessing people. They're too high up. There's a kind of distinction between the Earth Immortals and the Upper Immortals there, where the latter is pretty much perfect, but also unmoving in quite an Aristotelian sense of the word. But the former tend to be quite actionable. They engage in the world. You even see it in the name, right? Chuma, to take action, to begin something, in that they are in the world, that are working saints.
I love that. Something I just wanted to say briefly is you showed me a video some time ago of a woman being possessed by a weasel immortal, and she was shaking her head back and forth really violently, like side to side, left to right, over and over and over again, to the point that like it almost looked like it was going to snap off. And she was just speaking, or I should say rather, the weasel spirit was speaking constantly, like it was a deluge without end, like just constant chattering. And I was talking to you about this, and you said to me like, "Oh yeah, some of these will boast and be like, I am actually the Jade Emperor, like I am the highest of the high, and like I'm better than all of you," and will like climb the wall and stuff like that. I just love the boastfulness of it being associated with these like the most young out of all these yin spirits, and kind of very like the geometric figure of Poyer, from what I can understand. It just these kind of associations with like manlyhood of boys, of being boisterous, of kind of inserting yourself into all these situations.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of what they're famed for, right? Like they're the active ones, they're loud, they're here, they're gonna make sure you know it. And where's my banana? I want my one bow. Like, they'll come down and he wants his banana, man. You
This
gotta give
is
it to him.
That's very issue.
Gotta give him his yellow treasure. But the they like to chain smoke, they like to drink. But they're also like because of that extremity, I like them. They're very enjoyable to have around as long as they're happy. Because if the Who family are the leadership, then the Weasels are the kind of backbone, the main force of troops in the Immortal Army. If you want to
Mm.
compare them to like a contemporary armed force, then they're the infantry as well as the special forces. They act as messengers, they fight, they destroy demons and disease, they heal people. But they're also the scouts and so on. They probably have the most complicated reputation out of all the immortals because whilst foxes are more like well known for their ambiguous beliefs, weasels are especially related to hysteria and madness. Like I said earlier, right? Like extremity.
Mhm.
Because A weasel can be ecstatic, happy one moment, and beating you with his yellow ingot the next if you offend him. And like we said earlier, they're usually led by Huang or Tai, or Yellow Master the Second. But yeah, great guys. Just loud. But as
Yeah, that video, like she was loud, she was popping off.
oh yeah. Also the
But
ones most likely to speak upper language. Um,
like Mako went up.
not make kind of. It's more like because it's supposed to be understandable. Like you can learn it and everything.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah,
Gotcha.
as far as Serpent Immortals, it's kind of like cold, melancholic, noble, proud, and distant. And also the most yin of the Immortal family. They dance and they rife, and unlike the Hu and Huang families tend to be quite distant from humans, there's
Okay,
kind
word.
of yeah,
Like this is familiar.
yeah. There's some cases where I've seen like relations with dragons and so on. Um and not Baba Long style dragons, which is something fully recommend to anyone who wants a wholesome Chinese YouTube channel.
We'll put the link in the show notes for the Patreons because that has been my obsession as of late.
It's a good one. It's a good one. Because of the serpent family's kind of nature, if the Huang family is like the vanguard, the regulars, the Leo family or the Willow family, as they're known, are the artillery, the air force, the excessive force that's held in reserve to be used at the right place and time to deal with the situation. They're the most meat hungry and somewhat rarer than the Weasel and Fox families that we just spoke about. And the leadership of this family is a little more varied comparatively, varies based on the region. The one I was told about mostly was Red Snake Lady. For other people, there might be someone, like Liu Santaye and so on, but it kind of varies.
Hmm.
So that's the Snake family, or the Willow family, as we should properly call them now that I've introduced them. Next is the Bai family, the White family. So these are the hedgehogs who don't actually come down in possession all that often. They tend to be a bit more quiet, and usually they act as the sentries, as the guards, but in particular, they're very well known for medicine, healing. The hedgehogs are the best healers within the Immortal family. They're the ones who really work to make sure that people, you know, sustained and nourished. So they're kind of the ones who keep the house steady, the stability. If the Weasel family are about extremity on the Yang side, the Serpents are extremity on the Yin side, and the Fox is caught between that. The White family is the one who are kind of grounding everyone out. And that also obviously brings, maybe less change and less action, but protection, peace, quiet, and health. These are all things that are under their jurisdiction. And they're also, tend to be calmer, more peaceful. Usually they're led by the White Old Lady, who is a hedgehog immortal of some fame and very renowned for her healing abilities in particular. Finally, we have the Hui family, the Ash family. Really, it should be grey, but Ash is an appropriate translation and frankly sounds cooler, in my opinion.
It does sound cooler.
So, the Ash family, rats and mice, tend to be discreet. They're very closely associated with wealth in particular. Like all the immortal family are wealth gods. Like they're very closely associated with wealth and prosperity. But it's the Hui family who really have that money going. And that's partly due to their association with granaries, right? Like grain storage and so on, because where are you going
Hmm.
to find them? And there's also the sense of they have access to anywhere because wherever you go, they're there. So they have access to everywhere. They have all this information. if the other immortals are kind of military organizations, the Hui family is less so military and more so intelligence. Like, and I want to clarify that these kind of military analogies are not my, they're not my original ones. They're quite commonly used to describe the various families and their activity. That these are kind of just built into the culture itself as a way of describing their functions. Because Chinese
Hmm.
religion can be quite militant sometimes, and that's really cool.
Says my boyfriend who was playing Hearts of Iron 4 earlier.
Listen, the map game must be played. But
I respect it.
yeah, so Hui family is pretty rare. You won't see them too often, but that's more so because they're discreet, they're subtle. And when they are there, they're generally kind of the guy in the back of the room who isn't talking too much and then suddenly starts talking too much.
Hmm.
Um,
That's me. That's me at parties. I'm like silent for the first little bit. It's just a deluge. Actually, when you say like they're not usually around, they're less common, do you mean like on people? Like if a divination is in the sea, like do you have immortals on you? Like are you referring to like are these immortals present, or does everyone who catches the incense have all five?
so usually when it comes to catching and passing incense, nowadays people have all five.
Mm-hmm.
In the Qing dynasty, maybe the early Republican period, that wasn't the case. It was usually, hey, this guy has Hun Huang on him, or he has Huang on him. Like,
Mm,
you might just have one or two. Nowadays, it's kind of like they start recruiting other immortals and building up these big formations. So you would usually have all five. I'd say with the popularity of like the four beans, maybe it's rarer to see the White family and a Hui family. But generally, yeah, all five of the great immortals kind of walk with most disciples nowadays.
gotcha. Well, we have Bai Shen family, right? Because it starts with a B, and that's key this episode.
Shanky.
Bai Shen key. Our
It's a
our
good family
healing
name.
hedgehog man.
One thing that we kind of mentioned at the outset of the episode as well, in addition to me being the healing hedgehog man, were that there is, some regional variation as to like what these families actually are. So is it like these five animals or like the three animals plus ghosts as the normal compendium, or are there like other families that can find their way into the, I guess, five immortal families that walk with the disciple?
Yeah, so actually that's a good question. So the five immortals are the animals most capable of cultivation, but it doesn't mean other animals can't. For that, there are usually other categories, though they're never considered like as part of the five immortals. So we call them the Sanhua, the three blossoms or the three flowers, and the Wai Wuxing, which is like the outer five elements, with the five great immortals being known as the five inner elements. And again, this is a more
Mhm.
modern element. Oh, I'm using the word element a lot there. This is a more modern influence, but another one where it's kind of, it captures the animistic spirit of the religion in general, I think, quite well. So the Sanhua is animals that fly in the sky, animals that run on the land, and animals that swim in the sea. And the Wai Wuxing details the animals that have armor, the animals that have fur, the animals that have feathers, the animals that have scales in the sense of fish, and so on. So sometimes the Woshin can also refer to like specific groups like the five poisons, but the one I'm most familiar with is the one I just named. Different, different animals can have different qualities. All right. But the fifth one I learned was also plants and stuff for the Woshin. But
Mm.
yeah, in general, like they're not as common. Some old, like more traditional people will probably be like, if you mention it. But I don't think there's an issue with it. I think it's kind of an animistic element, right? Like it kind of captures the spirit of the whole religion, which is these guys
Sure.
can become immortals in the first place. So, as well as them, of course, we also have the ghost immortals. So the Ghost Immortals are led by the Tablet King, Bei Wang, who is usually a disciple who died. And this person, when they die, disciples sometimes, and this is yet another reason why Orthodox Taoism is uncomfortable with it, sometimes stick around to guide other disciples as ghosts. And usually they do this by taking command of the other ghost immortals because the ghosts tend to be the most problematic in most halls. Like a lot of halls are just dominated by ghosts and end up being kind of uh, impeded by the sheer number of yin spirits that didn't die the best way because these aren't like ghosts that died and cultivated to become immortals, right? They're not like these immortal family members. These are ghost immortals, people that died very unfortunate or difficult deaths before they were married, or priests, for example, who cultivated but had some serious moral failings. And so they got to heaven, were like, "Hey, I've got all this. I've cultivated my spirit." And heaven's like, "Yeah, but you literally went around killing people with all the things we gave you. So, no, you don't get to become a celestial bureaucrat and live a life
Mm.
of eternal joy. Instead, you're going down there and you're gonna, you know, that standard kind of afterlife stuff."
Yeah, except with even more bureaucracy than usual.
Well, I mean, Chinese religion, right? But it's one of the joys of it. In respect to the ghost immortals, they're usually divided into two groups. The first group is the Qingfeng, and people say this is the male ghosts. The one I was taught was different, and that is that the Qingfeng are people that essentially died young or before they were married. And then the second group is the Yanhun, which is so they died accidental deaths, horizontal deaths, like deaths that were
Mm.
wrong, like being hit by a car, for example.
So they're like restless.
Yeah, like both of these all ghost immortals tend to be restless. Uh, but like yeah, in this case, these are the ones who died like the violent deaths or the accidental ones, whereas the first one is like they died young or without marriage.
Hmm.
Um, and obviously, all the connotations of Chinese ghost culture, which is way too much to go into in this episode. I think we've already been quite a while. So, yeah, I mean, with that, that's kind of the Immortal family in a nutshell, especially the kind of basics of the practice. We didn't go into too much detail in respect to what gets done practically, but hopefully this has been something people enjoy hearing about and discussing. I think it's a topic that has definitely captured the popular imagination. So,
Absolutely. Thank you so much for teaching us this. I think Key and I have been especially privileged to listen along to you exploring a lot of this stuff over the past few years. And I think I speak for everyone, I hope, in just being especially grateful for the richness of the information you provided that's just not available out there in English, and for helping contextualize so much of the material you obtained from talking to disciples in northern China and in just all the different kinds of things that you've gone to in your adventures. So thank you so much. That was lovely, and I'm sure there will be more explorations of all these things in future episodes. But I think it's great that we have one just to refer people to in terms of like this is the general arc of this tradition. And this is what we refer to when we bring up the immortal family or the five families of the animal saints.
shoot, shoot. So,
Mhm.
what about everyone's Akashic records for the day?
Oh man, mine after going through some of your notes was Breakdance of Yao by the Shanghai Restoration Project. Because I just that violin solo, let me tell you, it kicked in always at the perfect time, and hopefully a little topical. So I was putting together a playlist on Spotify of all the Akash records for the podcast, and I realized sometimes they are like so thematically on point, and then sometimes it's just like here's a mix from Eurotrash that Key was listening to when he did some of his research. And I like how diverse it is.
Definitely, yeah. We have a smattering of deep cuts in there that are always really nice to see, and you know, always love to hear Svingo's Akashic Records because a music taste as eclectic as mine is hard to come by.
Well, thank you.
And yours I hold in very high esteem.
Likewise. You're always introducing me to great new music. So I think the Kaj record Spotify playlist, which I will definitely throw up the links on the website and many other places. It is a testament to some of that eclecticism.
So speaking of northern Chinese or southern Mongolian shamanic aesthetics, my Akashic record of the day is Wolf Totem by The Who. That is
Fucking love The Who. Could listen to UVU forever and Wolf
yeah.
Totem, and the track they did for Star Wars Jedi Fallen Order. Every time I try and get any device to play their shit, it will play like The Who, like WHO.
Yeah.
Instead, which drives me nuts. But yeah, it's The Who HU, which ironically enough, right, is um, also the word for fox, though that's not what this is referring to. Absolutely amazing Mongolian throat singing and some fire flames freaking music videos. I barely missed the opportunity to see them live. But I definitely will catch them next time. It's just I had a ritual appointment and was traveling for some initiatory reasons, so unfortunately I didn't get to see them. But next time.
Yeah, for sure.
Next time. So I guess my Akashic record, yes, I'm actually doing one today.
Hell
Although
yeah.
it's not really a record and it's not really a song. But speaking of animals that have become immortal, it would be the huh cat.
Huh?
Oh,
Huh?
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 That's that's all I've got to say.
Absolute legend of a cat meme. Which you are just fluent in cat memes. Like you always find the best ones to send to me. Like I appreciate how much you cultivate them. That's on your own path of cultivation is the cat memes that you then forward to me. But yeah, we literally got a Q&A for this month that was like, you guys have great taste in music. Can Salt please suggest them as well? So well, now you have it. It's the cat going huh.
Huh?
It's the transmission of Salt's music taste is a little too secret apparently to be known. I mean, I do want you to suggest songs, but it's definitely something that I think is you will like a precision strike do that when the moment arises.
Correct.
Mm-hmm.
There's sometimes you just gotta wait for the right moment.
Like a praying mantis immortal. Well, there you have it. Thank you all so much. Please check us out on twitter.com/frightfulhowls and patreon.com/the frightful howls. Every month you get Salt's amazing almanac of astrological magnificence. You get bonus episodes every month, which is the Q&A. You get to ask us the questions and we'll structure a whole hour episode just around answering them and chatting with you all. Get the plan of the month with the almanac lore, get opportunities to suggest episodes, and so much more, especially coming now with our new we'll be coming in hot January next year, our book club as well. And please, if you are listening to this on Spotify, on Apple, on YouTube, on anything, give us a like, a rating. It really means a lot. It boosts us in the evil demiurge of the algorithm and helps us reach more Karsists and witches and sorcerers and all manner of devil worshippers and those who have caught the instance of their own traditions, as it were. But yeah, thank you all so much. And what a shock. This time it's not Kia reading The License to Depart.
Mm-hmm.
My oh my, yeah, it's actually not that's Mr. B key to you doing the exorcism or the license, or well, that's not always even a license to the depart, but we have a little prayer or a little conjuration or a little adjuration at the end to send us off and all the spirits participating in the episode to be on their merry way. This time it's Salt reading it, and can you explain what it is exactly?
So this is Zhao Yu for Qing Xian, to invite the immortals.
Yeah, not actually in that case, unless it's a part, rather an invitation to come in, which I'm super looking forward to hearing you pronounce because you've been crushing it. All right, show it to us.
出马出马，神兵速大，请下人先，耳听目下，如是在山，苦有绕绕，神令福日，福爱垂下。By the decree of the Golden Blossom sect leader, quickly, as urgent as a command.